We believe it all starts with a patient. So what happens when a patient, a liver patient no less, one of the 500 million people living with conditions that often go undiagnosed, untreated, or misdiagnosed, mistreated, and stigmatized, brings the challenges of liver patients front and center? And what happens when a patient then leads a discussion with world experts in policy, research, clinical care, and wellness on ways to overcome these challenges? Let's find out today on GLI Live. Hello and welcome. I'm Donna Cryer, the founder and CEO of the Global Liver Institute, and I have the privilege of being your host for this, as for most episodes of GLI Live. But I hope you have enjoyed some of our guest hosts, meeting the wonderful team, including Jeff McIntyre, our Vice President of Liver Health Programs, who is off representing our delegation at the European Liver Meeting right now. So you'll have to make do for me and my fabulous guests on a really big, literally, and important topic. And so today we'll be discussing big issues and big data for liver patients with some of, frankly, my favorite people in the world, and that is not an exaggeration. Many of you know the wonderful Dr. Julia Wattacheril. She'll be our actual, gastroenterologist, hepatologist, and medical expert today here. And then I have one of the biggest influences on my life and my career in patient advocacy and engagement, Anna McCollister, who's with Invitae and a member of the HIT policy committee who advises our United States government on technology practices, something we all are rooting for these days, I know. And Ryan Moog is head of clinical trials at Datavant, a company that I know after this episode, you're going to be sort of, Googling and researching and wondering, why haven't you heard about them before? So I thank you all for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So Anna, I'd like to start with you because big data is a big topic. What is it? What does it mean?
What is big data?
Yeah, that's all. 30 seconds. What's big data?
Big data is a term that's thrown around a lot these days. It refers to essentially all of the data that's being collected across multiple industries, multiple devices, and the harvesting of that data for use in various projects, research, etc. It's a very big term. It can be applied to lots of different things, but essentially it refers to all of the things that have been digitized over the past 20 years or so that generate data, both, collect data, generate data, both directly and indirectly. And then that data is used and accessed and analyzed to inform different decisions. Big data in healthcare, it refers to electronic health record data, medical device data of different sorts, medical claims data, genomics data, epigenomic data. I mean, any kind of data that is generated that could be collected and curated and analyzed to potentially inform an array of different decisions, including improving research and our understanding of disease and care.
So let's bring it home then to hepatology. Dr. Wattacheril, give us examples of how you're using data in your work at Columbia and New York Presbyterian.
Thanks, Donna. I think the first orientation that I always want to emphasize is that this is human data. And humans, human data. There's a way that we can, in the anonymization and harmonization, lose the humanity. And so that's something that fortunately work with data scientists who understand the origins of that data and the preciousness of that data. And that can be delivered. And I will go into that a little bit later. We use data in a host of different ways. The most practical way when I'm knee to knee with a patient is their individual and longitudinal data. That's the most sensitive, precious, highly identifiable in the high trust environment, or what we try to maintain is a high trust environment between a provider, a doctor or nurse, a healthcare provider, and the recipient of that healthcare. It could be anything from a total bilirubin to, whether it's a whole genome, whole exome, et cetera, and how we interpret those types of data. But one of the most practical ways that we use data over time is looking at trends. I tend to focus on metabolic liver disease, pre and post transplant. And so when we're looking at trends, not overreacting or underreacting to one data element, but looking at the course of that person's lifetime, what can we predict? How can we intervene to avoid a bad outcome? How do we keep wholeness and wellness front of mind? And that includes some things that are not captured well in data, like feeling narrative. And so developing tools and techniques that retain the humanity of what's important to a patient, not just what's important to the investigator or what's important to policymakers or what's important to insurers. And so those are some of the practical individual level ways. I think part of Jeff reaching out to me, I think for the context of this is what we did, created an algorithm. The question that keeps me up at I'm a transplant hepatologist in one tiny element of the universe. How do I steward my skill set better for the populations that have access to me and the brilliant people that I get the privilege to work with, including the patients that bring up the best ideas we have. And so leveraging population level data in a very diverse patient population, English speaker data elements, but across and something that could be translated to other healthcare systems that can be tweaked with their sensitivity, their population, their priorities. So both individual and population.
I think certainly as a patient now 28 years and counting post liver transplant, I do have a lot of questions and that I'm trying to get answered that often do need data coming from more than just my center, certainly more than just my data, even extensively over the history, but really the data that's been done across transplant systems and across countries. And so, Ryan, I know that, or at least my first interaction with Datavant was linking data across academic systems and claims systems. Maybe tell us a little bit about that work.
Sure. So, like Anna said, over the last couple of decades, we've invested a lot as an industry and as a society in the digitization of patient information. And that's wonderful. And especially for research, that's borne a lot of fruit. The challenge has always been that inherently the way that all those data are used, it's still very siloed. So you only have a picture of what happened to that patient within that health system, or maybe within that family of health systems, or maybe within what's happening with a patient within a single payer interaction with an insurance provider. And so again, like lots of wonderful data to be gleaned from that, but there are inherent limitations because your insurer isn't aware of everything that is happening in your life. Your provider isn't aware of every single piece of your medical history. A great example, prior to Datavant, I spent 13 years working at an electronic health record vendor. And while there's enormously rich information there, you don't know that a patient, that a patient was prescribed a medication. You don't know that a patient necessarily picked up their medication. You may not have more information about that patient's full familial background. You may not have information about, does that patient have social determinants of health that are potentially impacting their care? Do they live in a food desert? Do they live at home by themselves? All of those things impact us as patients. And so Datavant was really founded to be an agnostic, ubiquitous connector of those data sources. Those data sources are all de-identified, so you can't just find Ryan Moog in one data set and Ryan Moog in another data set. And myself as a patient, I don't really want that information out there. So what Datavant does is enables, in a privacy-preserving way, connectivity between those data sources, so that you can link patient data from an EHR with pharmacy data, with claims data, with social determinants of health data, with genomics data, to really complete a full picture of that patient that you're studying. And when I say that patient, I'm not necessarily we're isolating a single patient. We're looking at a cohort, but enables us to look at really those patients' full longitudinal medical histories, and really, really importantly, again, as patients, preserve privacy at the same time. So anytime you inherently link a whole bunch of different sets of information together. It gets really granular and it gets to be a really specific person. And so certainly as data scientists, as healthcare economists, as epidemiologists, we also want those data to be ensured that they're still de-identified, so that every step throughout the whole process, we ensure that you can't ever re-identify a patient. So that's really been our calling card, and our focus as a company is not necessarily producing new data. It's enriching and supercharging data, and then also ensuring that patient privacy is at the forefront throughout.
So Anna, I know, you and I have had many conversations as these issues of how patients could wrap their minds around and have some comfort level with privacy and security. And we know that there are individual sensitivities and preferences around that. You've worked on a lot of principles and how to explain those to patients or engage patients in those activities. And so how should people, whether they are patients with as extensive experiences as we do in interactions with the healthcare system, start to think about these issues that they just may read about in the newspaper and may cause some alarm? How do you help people to understand and think about the major concepts, and so that we can engage in all these different things that we're talking about in the course of this conversation?
So it's important to realize there are many different ways of breaking up describing data, but the two biggies that are relevant, I think, for this discussion is identified data and de-identified data. So identified data is data that your physician will have access to, that he or she may share with another physician within the same hospital network, that your insurance company will likely have access to in some form, that tells them or allows them to see who is the patient that's being treated, who is the patient to whom this lab work belongs, and allows doctors like Julia to be able to see a longitudinal record of their patients, so that they can understand over time how that patient's health has changed. Very important. The law HIPAA, which many patients have heard about and probably signed a disclosure for, provides significant protection for identifiable data, but it provides an access and a mechanism and a set of instructions for how you can de-identify data and take away the identifiers that will then allow that data to be aggregated and collected and then analyzed for other sort of secondary retrospective research purposes. And that happens a lot. So most of the uses of big data that we're talking about, I'll just note that my office is next to an elementary school playground, so I'm not touring. And they were very quiet until recently. Most of the stuff that we're talking about within the context of big data is really de-identified data. And that's the kind of companies such as Datavant that use the technology of tokenization to be able to link different data sets is critical, because you need to be able to glue those different data sets for one individual across different institutions, devices, insurance companies, etc. So what does that mean? As a patient, I co-founded a company to do big data analytics as somebody who had no background in data analytics, because I was frustrated with the lack of use of real world data and over-reliance on randomized controlled trials, which are incredibly important, but I also think that we pretend they are more meaningful than they actually are, which has important ramifications from a policy perspective. So I wanted to help create tools to be able to use what we call real world evidence, which is essentially big data, de-identified big data, to inform drug development, policy development, regulatory decisions, etc. It's incredibly important to be able to do that. It has, we've already seen significant benefits from a research perspective, but there are things about it, particularly within the current social environment of incredibly low social trust, that can be concerning to patients. And that's one of the things that I work with my clients on, is thinking through how you can make the fact that their data is being used, de-identified, in some cases identified, but mostly de-identified data is being used for all of these things that they know nothing about. My client Invitae, which you've mentioned, is unique in many respects in terms of their commitment to getting this right. They allow patients to be able to choose to not allow their data to be used for research. Most companies do not. In most cases, it's perfectly, in all cases, it's perfectly legal once you reach the definition of de-identification to be able to use that data however the data holder wants. It is being traded, it's being shared, it's being sold. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. As a patient who has generated and continues to generate lots of data, I'm generally okay with that because it's important for that data to be well developed and clean, like fresh EHR data that hasn't been cleaned, curated, normalized. It's a mess. You can do absolutely nothing with it. You have to have somebody to invest the resources in making it data that's usable. However, one of the things that's always bothered me is not really having a sense of what's happened with that data after it's being used. And that's something that I've been calling on companies to do for quite some time, is to be transparent about how they're using the de-identified data that they have collected, perhaps purchased, that represents the lives of thousands, if not millions of patients. And what are they doing with it? And by and large, and again, my client company, Invitae, the first that I'm aware of to release a transparency report. But by and large, most of the stuff that's being done, I think most patients would be very happy about. This is good research. It's important research that's really driving the field forward. But the lack of transparency promotes a sense of, I cannot trust what these companies are doing with my data, because there are so many bad actors that we all hear about in other industries and other sectors.
Right. So we go from these high-level conversations to patients that I see and my team sees who are just posting their liver lab results on Facebook saying, can somebody tell me what this ALT elevation means? And so I want to help people understand some of these benefits that they could get from appropriately having their data shared. So Dr. Wattacheril, tell us some of the types of projects that you work on, some of the types of questions that you and your patients have that you've been able to answer using research.
So I think the first thing I always want to know is what's the context with which that patient is curious? Do they feel safe? And have they had bad experiences already? I cannot tell them about a privacy policy or try to reassure them they've already had a bad outcome. And at this day and age, whether it's credit card hacking, something, cybersecurity, some element that they've felt exposed, and how that was forms more sensitive data. So it's the context of their experiences before we start exploring anything even in the research related realm. For large aggregate population type data that is that's aggregating like our 6.4 million patients here at Columbia Presbyterian, those types of stuff, it's relevant to the context of that person. So I want to know through human relationships, if we apply XYZ non-invasive test calculators, we identify 3 million people that have stage 2 or beyond fatty liver disease that they don't even know about it. How are we going to reach them in a way that they want to be reached if they want to know something? And will the system support the care that requires? Are they still within the ecosystem? Or are we dealing with something that popped up 2 years ago and who can track down that patient? So again, knee patient to patient level data. I had a person reach out recently because she wanted a detailed discussion for her maternal aunt, strong family history of fatty liver disease, unknown quantification of environmental cofactors, potential genotype testing specifically. So for the context of that individual in that pedigree, in that family tree, that is proactive enough to seek a second opinion, that's one range of care. But again, for some of our minoritized communities and our marginalized communities that may not be aware that some of this testing exists, how do we make the system reach out to those folks who may not be aware of the latest genomic testing or that someone here is offering? So
I was going to say that's so important. It's one of the reasons that certainly having been on the board of the Personalized Medicine Coalition, working with some of our partnerships in the Hispanic medical community around education on the PNPL3 gene and understanding that there may be this genetic predisposition. So many are told that it's simply diet or there's fault finding, but knowing that there's a genetic factor, just helps people wrap their mind around having a diagnosis of fatty liver disease or NASH just a little bit differently. And it's also drives some of our work in making sure that there are the right ICD-10 codes so that you can go back and find people, maybe they were diagnosed with what happened to them, or maybe if we look at the people who have type 2 diabetes and look a little deeper, maybe we realize that they have fatty liver disease in such high prevalence rates as well. And so I think that there are myriad questions, patient-focused questions that could create a really robust research agenda in addition to the ones that we already have.
Right. And it's, again, centering the human who's asking the question. If genes are not of interest to you, but you want to know how what's in your refrigerator, if you have the privilege of refrigerator, interacts with those genes to promote or progression or regression of your disease, if that's what's important forward, that's what's relevant. We can wait on the genomics discussions, but I think the brilliance of where we are, the extraordinary opportunity of where we are with both governance and policy, which needs enhancement, just like Anna mentioned, and the exploration is that we can look at multiple factors at the time. It's like having competing feelings coexist at the same time. Like we can actually look at genes and environment in real world sorts of applications in a patient meaningful way. And patients are there for at the long time process that is well heard by many of us, but it will help flog the system in a good way because it's their lives, it's their family and their loved ones' lives that are most concerned. Not necessarily the time horizon that institutions are necessarily dealing with.
So, Ryan, in your work in clinical trials, how can the future of trials be different than the way they've been done in the past?
Yeah, I mean, the history of clinical trials is written in infinite pieces of paper called report forms, and about 20 years ago, they became electronic case report forms. And so you've got this digital component to it, but it's still very siloed to just what's happening to that patient while they're on a clinical trial. There are some really exciting new therapies that are in the pipeline that have been released recently for liver patients. But importantly, clinical trials, as much as companies and academic medical centers invest in them to learn as much as we can about the safe and effective use of new therapies, really, really important that we don't just look at that snapshot. We understand the full patient picture of what happened to that patient before they entered in the trial. And really importantly, especially when they stay on the medicine or the new therapy afterwards, is that we're monitoring what's happening long term. Companies who run clinical trials inherently look for efficiencies. Every new data point, every new visit with that patient 6 months down the road, 10 years down the road, those all have real costs. And so one thing that big data and this especially this de-identified healthcare data ecosystem we've been talking about can do is enable ongoing monitoring of those patient populations in a really safe and effective and also efficient way. That doesn't require already overburdened clinical trial sites to keep entering additional data. So and the great news here is like regulatory bodies like FDA have been really supportive of this. They recently announced that the cell and gene therapies, which are some of these really exciting therapies that are in the pipeline, actually need to be patients who use them and take them need to be able to be monitored for 15 years in some cases. That's a huge burden on the trial ecosystem, the infrastructure in the US especially, but big data really enables that monitoring of patient populations in a consented and also in a privacy preserving way to enable us to monitor and look and see, hey, this patient safely and effectively used this new therapy during the trial period. Did that last? No one wants a quick fix. Everyone wants to be using therapies that have been proven to be safe and effective in the long run.
I'm going to expand the conversation a little bit towards real world evidence, because this has been this particular use case is sort of top of mind for me, and maybe for many people as we've gone through this allergy season. And I'm just going to ask from your different perspectives and views of this field, just for reactions to it. I have been wondering about how I, as a patient, can feed my outcomes data, basically, back into the system to help to create more of a learning healthcare system. It's certainly outside of a randomized clinical trial environment, but it's more like the actual questions that people have. So it would go something like this. So how does a liver transplant recipient who is on Prograf, clearly some more prednisone, and I'm on Remicade for my IBD, as well. But what happens when you have severe allergies in somebody who's already immunomodulated, who's never had allergies before? And so I want somebody to benefit from the fact that it took quadrupling my prednisone, taking some Claritin D, some Flonase, and a few swigs of old-fashioned Robitussin to finally get me back on my feet. And sort of how we did this, because we changed and we worked with this over the past few weeks, and I'm running around today and have a voice again, and so it worked. How does all that knowledge, is there a mechanism for any of that knowledge to feed back into the system? So Dr. Wattacheril, the next time you have a transplant recipient who has severe allergies for the first time, you might better know what to do, because there certainly wasn't anybody like me, in the typical clinical trial. And so how can this information somehow become part of the flow of the evidence? And there might not be a right answer, but I know each of you have sort of thoughts on this type of thing, and maybe starting with Dr. Wattacheril and going to Anna, and then Ryan. How can this be the new research?
Yeah, so individuals who study themselves are among my favorite patients. As independent of their altruism, they are a partner in their care, and with all respect for every time and boundaries as well, just because the difference with the healthcare system experience isn't always a matched sort of opportunity. So the lowest hanging categorization by ancestry is what probably more so than social constructs like race. But practical question that a patient will ask me is, does this study apply to me? They do their homework, or their grandchildren do their homework, and this data, and there's no one that looks like my mom in this study, or the doctor who conducted this study. Did you see the entire team? They don't look anything like it.
Right.
So trust, it has to be done in an ecosystem and can talk about their data. You picked one of the most complex systems, the immune system. Post-transplant. So it's going to take the time horizon for the return on your individual level, and to apply that generalizably to a particular patient. I think it's probably sooner than I anticipate, but you are, my guess is that some of this is already being anonymized in a healthcare model that you may or may not be aware of if you're putting in one of the larger healthcare systems. And the medical decision making, this is the art of medicine. If you're thinking about code, or like how I think a lot about how I would automate some of the things that I do to lead or teach somebody, and toggling through the decision-making branch points of care, taking into context that weight gain or acne matters to people as much as their outcomes of their allergies. So side effect profiling, et cetera. I think short-term, some of the use this drug, don't use this drug, this responds better to this drug versus that drug, on a short time horizon in terms of being able to use that data if it's not being done already. And then at the longer time horizon will be the panoply of better tests. I think what will happen is there will be better tests developed to take something that's a little bit more diffuse, like an response and your immune system in the context of immunosuppression far after transplant, to make the algorithm more scientifically based, rather than a little bit less artistically nuanced gut doctor based.
I think that's fantastic. Anna, how do we, as proactive patients with a lot of data that's often held outside of the healthcare system, how do we make that information useful?
It's challenging, to be completely honest. I mean, the biggest mechanism at this point for getting data into the real world data into the research environment is through electronic health records. And right now, the vast majority of electronic health records do not accept data from devices. For instance, if you were using your, some sort of a mechanism to track your symptoms at home to be able to inform it or whatever. For instance, I use a continuous glucose monitor for my type 1 diabetes, generates data every 3 to 5 minutes. For years, I've been wanting to donate that data to research. It's pretty difficult. It's gotten better. There's now one research group called the T1D Exchange that has a registry for type 1 diabetes that's collecting it from specific centers. But importantly, one of the things that we have done as a type 1 community is I and a couple of others helped start a patient hacker movement called the We Are Not Reading movement that is now, I just did some of the nerdy early policy stuff, but it's now global. There are developers all over the world. I'm running a closed loop artificial pancreas system that was crowdsourced, and my blood glucose is better than it's ever been. But one of the cool benefits of that is we now have these thousands of people globally who are using these systems that are built by patients and parents of patients, completely outside of the context of medical device companies and the regulatory system. They have now created these pools of data that people are using and accessing. And many patients are looking at the data and saying, coming up with their own research and their research aspects. Patients like Dana Lewis, who is one of the leaders of this movement, has done some great research looking at the data that's been collected and aggregated and analyzed. So that's one way to do it. It takes a lot of effort from a lot of different people for it to be relevant. But importantly, one of the things that we really need to do as a patient community and as a professional community is to ensure that the electronic health records of the very near future incorporate data from medical devices and data collected in the home setting into certified health IT. That is currently not the case, nor is it on the roadmap. And that's one thing as a member of the Health IT Advisory Committee, to which I was appointed in December. That's one thing that I've been advocating for, and that I'm hoping that we will be able to make some progress toward. Because for people like me and you, we're constantly generating different forms of data. And that is the data that actually tells the story of how we are living with conditions, how we are maintaining our health or struggling to maintain our health. And none of that is incorporated into the most, significant vehicle for using and collecting real world evidence, which is the electronic health record system. In some cases, you can, if you have an iPhone, there's probably a Google version of this, but you can sign up through an app on your iPhone for different research studies. But those studies have to be designed and initiated by a researcher somewhere who has funding and has the ability to initiate a study that could be done through an iPhone. And that really just depends on who wants to fund what kind of research. So if there's somebody out there who wants to fund looking into the impact of, ridiculous allergy season and, death air from fires in Canada onto, then, that's a way to do it. But it really depends on, is anybody going to fund that? Is that something NIH cares about? Is that something that, a private donor wants to fund? And that really does, unfortunately, fuel much of the traditional research.
So, Ryan, as you work with several different types of patient advocacy organizations, some who do fund research and keep registries, some to add some additional fields and experiences to match to EHRs, claims data, and others. What are you excited about? The future of more patient-partnered clinical research?
Well, two quick topics here. And the first one is I am really excited by some recent legislation. I know that I know some people will certainly be aware of this. Maybe not everyone is. There's a U.S. legislation called the 21st Century Cures Act, which was enacted and became active a short while ago. Really forces the hands of a lot of healthcare data holders to ensure that those data can be as liquid as possible. And liquidity here really just means able to share, able to transact, able to gather. And so we are certain, I fully concur with everything that's been said so far. We are not all the way there yet, but I think we're on a better path now than we were even 3 or 4 years ago in terms of really ensuring that data are shareable and that patients ultimately hold the keys, if you will, of being able to say, hey, I'd like my data to be able to go to source X or source Y. So that's the first thing I'd say in terms of just encouragement. And the second thing is really, especially if I were a patient wanting to share my data, I think the first thing I would do is talk to my care team to see if there is a registry to submit data to. The reality is these registries, which oftentimes are assembled by life sciences companies, academia, industry advocacies and societies, they're assembling a lot of useful information that in most cases is more therapeutic area focused and granular than data that might be captured in like a claims data set, certainly that's really universal to the data captured as part of the insurance transaction. But anyways, like I would really start talking to my clinicians about that, because in many cases there are already registries maybe that they're participating in, or could even consider joining. I know that every organization that has got that funding and is collecting data is always on the lookout to grow those data sets. And the reality is, when you submit data to things like that, I know I participate in the registry for a medication I'm taking. My wife participates in the registry for a medication she's taking. Those get used again and again and again in a patient privacy way or privacy preserving way, but enable lots of downstream decisions, insights, peer-reviewed journal articles that are always coming out that are advancing our knowledge of different therapeutic areas, different conditions, different types of procedures, different types of therapies. So long story short, we have a great opportunity here, but definitely be on the lookout for ways to do that and initiate that conversation with your providers.
I think that's a perfect point to leave us all with. Talk to your providers about the research that they're doing, maybe even fund some, and continue to work with us as we have patient ambassadors who are both designing research as well as advancing this culture of participation in research, particularly here in the liver and digestive space. So I thank you all for being here today.
Please be sure to like this video, subscribe, and share your thoughts and suggestions in the comments below. Join us weekly on Wednesdays at noon Eastern Time for more episodes of GLI Live. Check out our website, globalliver.org, and follow us on social media to learn more about the Global Liver Institute and stay up to date with the latest in liver health. Until next time, stay safe, stay well, and stay connected.